panel, there are three important outcomes of which a post-conflict society ought to aim for. One, we don't want to reignite hostilities that have already happened in status quo. Second, we want to move towards active rebuilding of society, which we think is a middle-term outcome one. And finally, we want to move out of a post-conflict society to a more normal form of a functional democratic government. And we think in order for us to do that, we must side with the proposition coming out from the government. In doing so, I have a few things in my speech. First, framing. Second, a principle justification, and two outcomes in terms of practical benefits that we'll be able to achieve. First, in terms of framing. First, we would like to note that the wording of the motion suggests that the type of society we're living in is moving towards where a group or the government that is in power is one that is more inclusive, is one that doesn't have a lot of the tyrannical majority individuals in status quo. The reason why we're saying this is because the motion assumes that the government has a fiat, an ability for them to control a narrative, for them to suppress any information that is contrary to what the government's beliefs are. Having recognized that, I've already talked about the three outcomes that we want to achieve on side OG. Let's move on to the practicalities of this. So we think there are three methods in which this proposal will happen. First, in terms of media. So we think that we'll suppress any and all news or any narratives that are putting these dictators or tyrannical governments in the past in a positive light or sympathetic or trying to justify whatever actions they're talking about. Second, any form of art. So we're talking about movies, paintings, and etc. All of these forms of media houses and portrayals of it will be in favor of us. And third, education. So in terms of what are the educations that will be portraying towards these individuals of society that's going past, we'll make sure that all of these things are consistent with not sympathetical portrayals of it. So what's the counterfactual then on side government? We think the counterfactual is going to be as such. We'll actively suppress any of all information that portray all of these acts of aggression in a positive light. So meaning anything that justifies why is it that an act was committed. Anything that portrays these individuals as someone that committed something that's good for the nation or for the individuals, will suppress all of these things. But we think at the worst case scenario, we'll even criminalize any extreme justification of this group. We think comparisons of things that have existed in status quo is censorship of misinformation, censorship of anything that is acquainted to a hate crime, something that can cause some form of animosity or aggression in people in society. We have already done all of these things and we think it is consistent with that. Before going to principle, yes, opening.
Was Gaddafi wrong to nationalize the oil?
It's not about whether it's right or wrong in terms of the motives of it, but the outcomes of it. I think the outcomes of post-conflict society is very much clear. The government that was dictatorial or tyrannical and how it killed a lot of people or caused a lot of harm, that is very much clear. These type of group cannot be portrayed in a sympathetic light, and it is something we're proud to stand for. Not now. Let's go on to the principle justification. First, why do we think this is necessary for rebuilding in of itself? So there are two impacts here. Let's talk about the stakeholders or individuals that exist in a post-conflict society. You've got a group which is more likely the majority group, which sided with the dictatorship government or one that benefited most from this group. And second is the minority groups or the victims. Let's talk about the individuals that sided with the dictatorial group. So more often than not, this could be the majority individuals on the ground. The moment you have got sympathetic or positive portrayal of these groups, these individuals in a post-conflict society will retain the entitlement that they retain at that point in time. Why is this something that is harmful? The reason that the conflict had grown into such a mass scale, a lot of destruction, is because there was a group that had a form of entitlement, that was a superiority complex that exists within society, that felt that they were better than the others. You look at Myanmar right now, the Rohingyas and the Burmese, Rwanda back in the past with the Hutus and the Tutsis. There was always an existence of one group feeling better than the other. In a world where you portray this light as individuals as sympathetic and what their leaders done as sympathetic, these sentiments will still exist on the ground as of right now. And we think the outcome, the harm of this will be discussed later on. But second, let's talk about minority groups. There are two reasons why this is harmful to us. And first, on a principal level of trauma, of how they are made to relive of all the harms and the dictatorial past that affected not just but them, but their family members, their loved one. We think this is something that is harmful. But second, the act of you justifying or sympathizing towards the dictators also leads to a justification that whatever harm or losses they go through is something that is justified. It was okay for them to go through it and go through all of this, and there's no way for us to move towards some form of reparations later on. What are the outcomes of this? I think there are three outcomes. First, I've already discussed about how first the sentiments would already exist, but second, this unity. In a post-conflict society, you must move individuals towards a more united front, but this only creates disunity amongst them. But then it can also create aggression of minorities on the ground, that their whatever harms and lived experiences that they go through is not affected as much, and their feelings is not as important as compared to the majority. We think at this point in time, if you were to compare both of these groups, we would rather side with the minority victims that have gone through so much oppression, so much loss of livelihood and loss of ability for them to progress in society compared to the majority group, which we think as much as it could be portrayed as also negative outcomes towards them. Yes?
So it's not easy to police art and education. Are you going to fill the schools and the art galleries with a bunch of police to find anything that possibly goes against?
Yeah, sure. I think this is it's a mechanistical thing. Like we can do whatever it takes to make sure that these animals don't exist. I think that's fine. Let's go on to the outcome, right? First, why do you think it fulfills the burden of a post-conflict government? So I think the most important thing is two things for a post-conflict government. Is first to maintain democracy and prevent democratic backsliding. Why do you think this is something that's more likely to happen? It's difficult for you to be a more inclusive government of everyone on the ground if and for purpose of rebuilding if sentiments that are antithetical towards this are in existence. So if you got individuals that are still talking about why the past dictatorship was good, why it was something that's justified, it's difficult for the government to maintain democracy because it's more likely for these individuals to reject any and all forms of reforms. So we talk about legal, social, economical reforms that this new government will want to posit because now this new government is unable to bring the people together. But we think this is harmful because it's more likely that majority group on the ground as of right now will be more inclined towards rejecting any and all democratical process that are in existence because they believe that the dictatorial past that happened in the past was something that's justified and brought them so much justice. So we think it's oppressive against what democratic governments are supposed to do. Everything is harmful to this government right now because they're unable to bring the country together for them to progress to execute whatever and all goals and hopes that they may have. Last practical outcome about how is it that it reframes societal mindsets in of itself. So we think the most important thing for the government at that point in time is to move individuals towards a more center front. Because now there could be people who are right and people who are left in terms of political beliefs or whatever beliefs that divided them during the conflict. So for the government to bring individuals together, there must not be one narrative that is too strong towards one side because it's difficult for the government to capture these individuals at that point in time. So it is more accessible for the government to focus more on a lot of reformations and etc. when individuals are more centralized. And this is also harmful for that state in a long term. Political parties in the future can always ride on these narratives of conflict because that's what captures individuals and more. So it's difficult for the government and political parties in the future for them to be more apolitical, a-religion or a-racial based groups. Panel, we think in this debate there are few outcomes that is important for post-conflict society. And if you have got a group or narrative that just reveres the dictatorship group of the past, it is harmful to this group and also harmful for progression. Proud to people. Here.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to open the debate inside opposition, I call up on the leader of up. Here.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. 5 observations about the OG case, why I don't think it holds as much water as they claim, and then moving on to the OO extension. Observation number 1, I don't think they have fiat to just say this is an open and inclusive democratic society. It's unclear why post-conflict means the conflict ended in a good way, it just ended. Second of all, I don't think it's clear that it's always the minority group that was oppressed and the majority group did the oppression. They literally mentioned Rwanda, where it was actually the minority group that was preferred by the colonizers, who actually gave them significant sway over the government, and that allowed them to inflict horrific genocide on the majority oppressed population. So when the inverse is flipped, presumably if this new post-conflict society, even if it is democratic, will probably favor the majority group, which makes suppression and backlash so much worse and easier to impact. Observation number 2, I think it's also unclear that the dissent that they get to claim, i.e. that this is just a mechanistic means of enforcing the motion, it's unclear that they can actually just claim that, no one's going to object to the fact that there are like secret police making sure that our textbooks don't mention anything good about the past regime. I think it's also important to note that regimes are more than just an individual. So we're not just talking about Gaddafi, we are talking about the Gaddafi regime and everyone that was a part of it. So every person that worked in the Ministry of Education, the people that helped implement the nationalization of the actual oil fields, which was pretty much actually one of the better things that Gaddafi did, including his push for the African Court of Justice as an alternative to the International Court of Justice as a form of decolonization. I think those things are talking about broad policies in which many people were implicated, and we're going to impact why that's so important. Third thing, the third thing was Rwanda is actually not helpful for their side. I think number 4, it's also just not true that everyone who's a part of the regime was necessarily going to believe that they are better than everyone, that there's some ethnic superiority. A lot of people, for reasons I'm going to explain, were often caught up in participating in regimes or participating in ways that aren't necessarily the most problematic. And when you are allowing people to have sympathetic, and this is an important observation here, sympathy is not the same as they were good. I think when we talk about sympathy on our side of the house, it is allowing individuals to recognize that, hey, maybe regimes were able to do some good things, maybe they made mistakes, but there were some elements of policy were good, or that the people that were part of it maybe weren't entirely evil. I think those sorts of sympathetic observations are not possible on their side, but are on ours, and I'll explain why they are likely to be dominant narratives that produce good outcomes. So, I got a point from CG.
The narrative you're scared of emerging, that is the one that says says that everyone of the same ethnicity was part of the oppression of minorities within the state is exactly the narrative that emerges organically on your side. On our side, when the state has control over dissemination.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I'm gonna explain why that's just not true. Alright, so just, we already taken the sympathy point, let's explain why that's likely to work out in the way that I just claimed. Number one, I think, again, because so many people are implicated, not everyone who's part of a regime was necessarily part of the secret police, not everyone was part of the military who oppressed people. I think there are many parts of a government, particularly large regimes, that have generally a large control over people's lives, or people that were A, caught up because often like family legacies and patronage, meaning if your dad worked for the Ministry of Education, it's very often in regimes that aren't particularly democratic that you would also be expected to participate in the government, and you'd have to like maintain the good favor of the ruling family. Number two, it looks like people that just need jobs, and if the only job is, for example, working in the military, that just might be your only option to not starve. And number three, then people can also just be caught up in sway. So this is very much like Hannah Arendt banality of evil. Individuals that don't actually feel necessarily horrific hatred of other individuals are caught up in bad acts as small cogs in a larger machine. Those sorts of things are sympathetic perspectives. On the government world, anyone that says, look, my dad worked for the military, but he didn't actually believe anything they did, and he just worked like on the sidelines, he never held a gun. That is a sympathetic view to an individual who, for example, may not have chosen, or may not have free will chosen to be a part of the military. On their side of the house, that is suppressed. All you get is information that is broadly unsympathetic or outright negative towards the old regime. Because individuals that are part of a regime are inherently associated with it, i.e., you wore the same like emblem of the Gaddafi family, you wore the same emblem of like the Pol Pot regime, you must be morally and associated with that regime. And I think what that means is individuals that participated in it, which is very likely to be a large number of people, are cut out of conversation. Here is the problem with that, and this is engaging with the CGPOI. When we talk about the organic marketplace of ideas that we get to defend on opposition, on their side, only one side gets to prevail. The regime was bad. Everything they did was evil. There is no excuse for being a part of that regime. There is no sympathy. On our side, you get individuals that are able to say, at the very least, like, look, I worked in the Ministry of Education. I was a teacher. And yes, I had to teach some indoctrination, but I also helped children learn basic arithmetic. That is individuals that are able to speak up on our side of the house. This prevents backsliding, because on their side of the house, all you get are narratives that everyone that was a part of it was evil. Particularly when you look at cases where regimes are ethnically tied, that looks like by association, this ethnicity must be evil. We must view them unsympathetically. On our side, it gives those communities, particularly when it is a minority community, that through no fault of their own were, for example, like given prioritization by colonial powers, the ability to say, whoa, like we are not wholly responsible for everything that happened under this regime. I think this is a bit of a backstop on the very worst forms of democratic backsliding, where leaders are able to win elections by mobilizing a base on the motivation of hatred, on retribution and mob justice. That is less likely on our side when individuals are able to say, like, there were some of us that weren't implicated, some of us had no choice. I think that cuts down on the ability of populist leaders to re-emerge in the future of this like relatively unstable post-colonial state, but it also means on balance panel that individuals in social contexts are a little more likely to find a bit of peace between one another. It's unlikely that someone's going to stand up and say like, I worked for the secret police. It's probably going to be individuals that worked in actually like generally agreeable parts of the regime, did actually sympathetic things that will speak up the most on our side. So we get the most like generally good people speaking up on our side to counter like what would be generally like really understandable grievances about horrific abuses, but at the very least you get some degree of nuance where people are able to recognize a regime can be bad, but not everyone that worked in it is necessarily bad. That is uniquely not possible in the government case, because anyone that tries to say, look, I didn't choose to be a part of this, I didn't want a part of this, are cut out because that requires sympathy to understand. OG.
Yeah. In a post-conflict society, do people process sympathy and have conversations about past tyrannical governments in a way that is meaningful and rational?
Yes, because people are capable of having empathetic conversations when they're able to, number one, hear from the people that experience something different than them. So it's very easy for me to live in an echo chamber where, for example, if my family historically experienced oppression from a regime, and then a new regime takes power that only allows my understanding of the circumstance, even again, if that understanding is very legitimate, to dominate, I will never hear a nuanced version of the other side, of individuals that were on the other side of that conflict. So on our side, at the very least, it is not just state regimes, but it's the capacity for individuals, literally like in Rwanda, where people had to make peace with their neighbors, people that they saw every day, through human interactions where you're just not scared to say, yeah, I worked for this regime, but I didn't have a choice, or I'm actually like proud of some of the parts I did because I helped educate children, or I helped again like nationalize an oil field. So you don't get the demonization of like, was actually some pretty good policies for sometimes in the Gaddafi regime, so you don't get that demonization, you don't prevent the backsliding where you get a far-right populist leader who's able to emerge by saying everything the old regime did was terrible, we need to go the opposite direction, or everyone from this ethnic group is terrible, we need to reoppress them as justice. I think on balance, when we use what is essentially a marketplace of ideas, a nuance that allows people to stand up and speak, I think only the most like fair, like reasonable people are going to stand up. No one's going to volunteer to say I work for the Gestapo. I think you're going to get more nuance. You get that peace and reconciliation. That is how we win.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to close the debate in opening government, I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Is this volume okay? Can everyone hear me? Perfect. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The paradox of tolerance refers to an instance where at the point at which you experience some form of oppression, where at the point at which there is a clash of personal liberties, when you allow the majoritarian group to say my liberties value, the value of my liberties weighs more than yours, that is the point at which you do not get the lush impacts that opening opposition wants to talk to you about. Because largely, a lot of the things and the setting of a post-conflict society is asserted by them. They assert that the point at which we allow for these individuals to participate in these conversations, that is when we're more likely to get empathy and people coming towards the middle ground. Never once acknowledging the fact, what happens when sentiments are still probably at a high, what happens when people still have feelings of nostalgia towards these past governments that were probably quite problematic, but probably took care of these individuals who are in positions of privilege way more, for them to see eye to eye with individuals who they don't view as the same level of them, who they don't view having the same human value and human weight as them. Why you get all these outcomes that you talk about is unclear. But let me deal with all the observations that they brought up at the start of the speech. Number one, they're unsure as to why this is a progressive setting, because tyrannical governments can side with the minority as well. Despite whether or not this is a minority or majority group, I think we can posit to you that this government is one that the onus is on this government to decide what is the point at which they want to move forward from. Which means that you are now at a critical juncture whether you want to decide how you're going to reform systems and restructure it so that we can probably be more inclusive towards minority groups, so that we can bring back democratic institutions that were probably stripped away or that were probably deconstructed at the point at which a tyrannical government came into play. Which means that even if you don't want to even if you don't want to choose sides on whether you believe this to be a majority government or a minority government, the lack of democracy in institutions, when we look at education or we look at electoral systems, affects minorities, affects people who probably are not valued as much, whether this be a silent majority who have their rights taken away because there's a more extreme and more vocal minority who take their rights away. The impact is still towards the smallest actors within the state. We argue that this is still a majority versus minority instance. Given that they also want to frame this debate as to why we should include people from the other side, I think they concede this implicitly in their speech as well. But next then, I want to deal with the largest chunk of the case that we are coming from them, and that is why this leads to a binary instance where people will feel a feeling of framing the other side as completely all being bad guys instead of having a nuanced way of people approaching this, right? Number one, it's unclear to me why they get this nuanced approach or nuanced perspective on their side either, right? They just posit to us that sympathy is likely to be a strong emotion. Therefore, when you get people and you understand that, maybe not everyone has been involved in the oppression that took place in the past, this means you have a greater ability to form a middle ground. But number one, I want to posit to you why these individuals are likely to be complicit in the first place. So it's very nice and rosy to assume that not everyone is a bad guy in the Nazi regime, but the point at which you picked up the uniform and you recognize that picking up this uniform meant that you're going to be involved in the suppression of fundamental rights, where you take away the rights of people to not just participate in society, but to be human, where you put these people into concentration camps, where you isolate them from the rest of society. I don't think that means that you have less of a complicity than the government or the structure in which you were working for. Because obviously, yes, this overarching structure that you're working for might have more malicious intentions in mind, but that means you were the medium in which they could progress these malicious intentions. You were the point at which you allowed for these malicious intentions to manifest in the suppression of democracy, to manifest in the suppression of rights of minorities then. But secondly, I want to argue,
when the point at which you allow for this sympathy to happen, that is when you activate the impacts of entitlement that Vinod beautifully explains to you. Because this is a post-conflict society, which means sentiments and emotions and nostalgia about past governments and tyrannical structures that were problematic are still existent in the psyches of individuals. Which means that the point at which you allow individuals who sided with this tyrannical government, who feel feelings of nostalgia for the structure that is no longer there, you allow them to forward past nostalgia in the forms of art, in the forms of media, which they can take control over and push their feelings of entitledness. But this is the point at which you activate the paradox of tolerance. The point at which you allow for there to be a clash of personal liberties and opinions means that majoritarian groups or groups that have some control over past structures still are the ones who are going to be having the upper hand in these conversations. Which means a lot of the sympathy that you want to talk about is going to be sided to the group that feels like they have a lot of their past the past successes of this country and the past successes of this particular instance to be activated. That is the point at which you allow worse off empathy that is one-sided instead of empathy for the people who actually deserve it, for the individuals who did not see rights and important fundamental liberties at the point at which this was still in place in the past. I'll take closing first.
What generally happens to incredibly powerful sentiments when they don't have any legal alternative for being represented?
Legal alternative. I mean, you don't prove why these legal alternatives to be represented are likely to manifest in your world. I don't see why you're going to give all these individuals in your world the right to say anything, right? There has to be some form of regulation. I'm pretty sure you would still have regulations for things like free speech, and you would have regulations for things like extremism, because obviously that's an incentive that exists in your world as well, where you want to prevent the reignition of past place or conflict. I'm unclear as to what these legal alternatives look like and what the line is where you draw, because that is the point, right? The reason why we're taking a hard line stance in the side of opening government is because at the point at which you allow for there to be blurring of the line, where you say maybe we can allow this but we're not going to allow this, that is when you allow for these majority groups and these groups who probably had power in the past to say why not more, why not do this more, because that is what we actually deserve. But the point at which you say that the starting point is one that's problematic, that the starting point of entitlement and the point at which you push these problematic beliefs is one that's problematic, I think you prevent it further from sliding into an instance where it's more extremist, where you probably have to do more in terms of regulating instances of extremism and instances of hate speech then. I think what am I going to tell you in my speech is just framing everything that we talked about from opening government. What did we say? We talked to you about, number one, why is this likely to worsen the aggression of minority groups? Firstly, on entitlement being a problematic starting point, and why it's important that we deconstruct and we uproot the starting point and tell individuals that this manifests in the worst ways possible, where you allow for remnants of past governments that existed, remnants of past tyrannical structures that existed to be exploited into instances where you can see past the problematic versions of past governments to take into to like be manifested, right? That's when you allow for the politicization of past incentives and past sentiments, where you allow for politicians to say, now that we allow these forms of interpretation, that gives us a better ability to use this to politicize individuals, to believe that this is something that we have to go back to. But we also secondly impacted in the point of democratic backsliding, where we told you that now that you have an onus as a current government to take control and decide how your country moves forward into the future, that is the point at which it's justified for us to suppress instances and to suppress sentiments that can use individuals that were treated horribly in the past to the advantage of current governments, which will result in a worse off instances, not just for minorities of the country, but for the overall rebuilding and the way that this country moves forward to in the future. So proud.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to close the debate to the opening half, I call up with the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here, here.
Everyone ready? That'd be great. I just like POIs, please. There's no verbal POIs. I promise I'll take one from each team, but just put your hand up, please. Thank you. Beginning in 3, 2, 1. I think the biggest problem with government is they actually aren't going to prevent any of the problems they tell you of in backsliding. The reason for this, and first I'm going to do, I'm going to give you a little more extension, and then I'm going to move on to some more in-depth rebuttal. First thing I want to note is that just because, and this is a simplified version of COPI because we were going to give it first, is just because you tell people to stop talking about something, specifically the government, doesn't mean they do. In fact, you probably ingrain those sentiments, i.e. when the government says, actually no, your history, your parents' lived experience, all those type of things are actually illegitimate. It is very unlikely that those people immediately go, oh, well, yeah, that makes sense. I guess everything I know about my culture and what my parents have told me is entirely wrong. The textbook said otherwise. Rather, what it likely does is silo these people, where now they will not listen to anything the government says, because it fundamentally goes against the basic thing. And note that this kind of paradox uniquely happens worse on their side, because they have to have these completely unnuanced portrayals of history, right? They can't talk about a civil war where there wasn't just an evil guy and a good guy, where often these things are complicated, split along ethnic and religious lines, where these things have complicated histories that uniquely will punish whoever doesn't happen to be the ruling government of the day, and uniquely push these people into the most worst forms, where they are in echo chambers, where all they are hearing is their own radicalization, where they are not talking to the other side, because they've already just completely cut off any communication, because they believe the other side is just trying to hit them with propaganda through the thing. I want to be very clear off the top of this debate what I think the burdens in this debate around is. Government can't just win by being we shouldn't have Nazis, right? That isn't enough for them to win. And on the same side, I don't think we have the burden of just being in every single instance, right? That isn't the inverse of this motion. They have to defend why you should always do this. We just need to explain why in most instances that probably doesn't make sense. It doesn't mean in some instances you can't have something. And if they want their strong counterfactual, we can still have hate speech laws on our side, which are very simple. All they say is that no matter what group you are targeting, you cannot discriminate them on these grounds. It isn't specific to a certain group or a specific regime. This is why you can have things like in Canada or many countries where we have hate speech laws that obviously apply to Nazis, but aren't uniquely targeting those people. And this is important because it allows the government to seduce a lot of the things that they want, or allows us to do a lot of things the government wants, without, again, uniquely targeting one specific group that now feels alienated specifically by the government, and is more likely to fall into insular circles where they're more likely to cause harm. Two main problems, or two main things that we get on their side that you cannot get on their side fundamentally. The first one, and my partner flagged this, is the banality of evil. I want to note that this is extremely important because a vast majority of regimes, a vast majority of the horrors of history did not happen because a bunch of truly evil people got together and just decided to start killing the other side. It uniquely happens through slow forms of dehumanization, through the collective work of societies. What is important for this is you need to have sympathy to understand how you got to that point. Now let's just make this very clear, because I think CG is probably going to try and contest it on some things. Sympathy does not mean glorification. It does not mean positive values. It means understanding. Literally, the root of sympathy is empathy, which is simply just understanding why people did things. You don't have to believe it. You don't have to justify it. You don't have to say that was good, but it's understanding where people came from. Why is that important in this debate? Because you don't need to condone people. You don't need to think people are okay for understanding why they do the horrific things they do. And this is critical because what it doesn't allow on their side is you can't understand people if you don't sympathize with them, right? If you just view the previous regime as this big boogeyman that just did terrible things, you're never going to be able to understand why people actually joined up, why people were middlemen, why people were conscripted into the armed forces, these types of things. Second thing I want to note is that by definition, this will just exclude a lot of probably good ideas that your society should buy. So this looks like nationalizing the oil fields, which happened in a lot of tyrannical governments who therefore fell after the fact. So you can look at Libya, you can look at Saddam Hussein, you can look at a lot of different examples. But this also happens to all types of other sorts of things. This looks like Soviet republics, which had 90% literacy, way above, who had more caloric intakes than a lot of Western countries. You're apparently not allowed to highlight any of those mobilizations of mass education and things like that because it was fundamentally done by a tyrannical dictatorial regime. This looks like a vast majority of Africa and Latin America, where you cannot talk about how a lot of these regimes that came into power came into on anti-colonial sentiments about taking it back from colonial powers. Yes, they became authoritarian regimes. Yes, they did their own harms, but a lot of the reasons that they did go into place. And that doesn't mean that you say it was okay for the people they killed, but what you uniquely say is we understand the ground thing. We should probably still have some degree of decolonization, but we probably shouldn't do it in an oppressive way that they argue with. I think these things are extremely important. Now, moving on to some direct rebuttal that I think engages with a lot of their case. The first thing I just want to note out of opening government, and I think to some extent it will be gov teams, is their case is extremely limited. Note their case literally only applies, or the countries I think we're talking about, literally only applies to democratic countries in which the former majority was the oppressor, right? That is like a tiny amount. One, there are just structural reasons for this, because often when colonial powers came in, which is probably a lot of the post-conflict societies we're talking about, since a lot of times these things were sparked by ethnic tensions put in by colonial powers, they often picked a minority group that had lighter skin or some kind of feature that they had affinities with, but also because they just realized it's a lot easier to put one small group in power, give them some benefits, and rule a country rather than placating the majority. So we're talking about, for structural and just historical reasons, this is not a lot of countries. Before I move on, let's take the UI from back, and then we'll take another one from over.
Do you think that tactically it would be a good decision if the Me Too movement, instead of centering stories of women who were victims of sexual abuse, instead centered stories about perpetrators and painted them in a particularly sympathetic light?
Okay, I just don't think this is analogous. They can explain why it is. That's their job. Second, go ahead.
So your argument on wanting understanding means you want understanding for the victims or minority groups. Why would the schools be able to understand this when your sympathizers are just justifying the trauma and all the lives that were lost by this group?
Okay, so the counterfactual to this is not the textbook is saying, actually, that dictatorship was awesome. Everyone who deserved to die. What this probably more looks like is, again, a nuanced discussion that says, here is why these people turn to these evil means. This is still wrong, but we need to understand why that happens. Maybe some people weren't as complicit in harm as they tell you. They tell you that complicity in harm is completely bad. I think one, I don't know if this is just principally true. I'm not sure if being drafted into like an evil military where they say they're going to shoot you and your family means that you like are entirely complicit in that. But even if you don't buy that it isn't principally justified, it just doesn't get the outcomes they literally tell you. You are not going to rebuild a society. You're not going to move towards democracy when you say like, apparently an entire vast swath of society was entirely evil and you can't count on them. You're never going to form democratic ties with them. You're never going to work with them in any meaningful manner. You're not going to be constructive with them. All you're going to do is suppress them. Note that their side literally uses tyrannical means, right? Like suppression of information and information police is like the things of authoritarian regimes. So they literally are becoming the thing they presumably want to stop. But also I think just on very basic grounds, they're just never going to actually get to the rebellion that they tell you. They're never going to get to those sympathies because again, you are just now furthering different groups. You will have the group that does read the textbook and then the group who goes home and says that was just a bunch of hogwash. So even the important stuff that in that textbook that they should have learned about correct history will automatically be disavowed. This is how you get more splintering in society. This is how you get more stratification. You get more violence, the worst forms of oppression, and you don't ever get the rebuilding very close.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to open the debate in the closing half and call up on the member of government. Here.
Cool. Is it okay if I speak like this?
Yeah, fine.
Great. Opening government correctly identifies the metric of this debate ought to be stability, but does not explain why stability happens as a result of their proposal. From closing government, we will answer the op team's challenge and explain why a top-down national narrative that suppresses the positive aspects of the regime is better than the conflicting narratives that emerge on their side. The first thing I want to do is explain why opening opposition, however, is very marginal in this debate. The problem with OO is that they fail to recognize that when you don't suppress information about a dictator, other national narratives form from the bottom up in the absence of that suppression. The difference is the narratives about the dictator that exist on our side form from the top down rather than the bottom up. That is to say, the state demarcates the exact extent of the demonization and explains where and how that demonization ends to people, rather than a bottom-up demonization of every single ethnic majoritarian background who oppressed the minority who now has rights under the new regime. We think that the exact thing opening opposition is so afraid of, the demonization of everyone from background related to the regime, happens far more in the absence of a government narrative that sets the exact parameters of these kinds of things, because the people who lost people in these regimes are going to be far more aggrieved on their side. On our side, we demarcate where and how we demonize people. That is, we demonize Nazis, but not all ethnic Germans. The second thing I want to state is that the case is very reliant on an uncharitable interpretation of proposition. Opening government, to their credit, propped the motion bravely and correctly, but they didn't prompt blanket demonization of everyone tangentially associated with the regime. They prompted selective demonization and non-presentation of information. For example, the demonization of people from different backgrounds is different from not talking about good policy things they do. They can just not talk about Gaddafi nationalizing the oil fields if it was good, and then opt to just continue doing it if it's really good policy. They can choose not to demonize soldiers on the periphery of a regime and focus on the top people engaged in the regime. Finally, a lack of understanding is intersubjectively problematic. I'm fine with prioritizing minorities' truth, the truth of oppressed people. If it's massively alien to people who suffered under the regime, if you don't do that, these people who lost many people are probably likely to say fuck you when you prioritize those narratives, for the same reason my POI raised, right? You don't platform abusers, you want buy-in from people who suffered abuse from men, for example, to the feminist movement, and these are the people who by their own logic are the people who are most important to gain buy-in from. So they lose that buy-in to the power-sharing agreements and so on structurally, because it's very, very hard for people who are oppressed to admit that these people have any sympathetic grounds whatsoever. Sure, closing.
Do you think a police officer can effectively demarcate what's acceptable expression of sympathy versus
Not an
unacceptable?
individual police officer, and that's crucially what happens on your side. But standards that are set by the government to demarcate acceptable behavior of police officers does work, and in fact that's exactly what the United States does in order to combat police brutality today. Note framing. Note that in post-conflict states, typically governments came to power following war via power-sharing agreements in which they overthrew the dictator and his regime. This is likely to be the context in which the debate is most relevant, which responds to opening opposition's challenge that debate takes place in a large amount of instances. Crucially, these dictators tend to be extremely unpopular in the immediate aftermath of the war. Beyond the obvious that they often collaborated with terrible extractive colonial powers, they often suppressed their population's right to free speech and free identity, there are a couple other reasons. Note that typically these governments came to power in a war of colonialism, power-sharing agreements where they overthrew the dictator regime. Crucially, these dictators tend to be very unpopular with the general public for all the reasons I've stated. This looks like Suharto collaborating with other colonial powers to bar non-Muslims from entering his government, or Fujimori shutting down free speech of indigenous people in Peru, or Bolsonaro doing the same. On our side, what we say is that supporters of the dictator are often a relative minority. They're unlikely to be able to recruit significantly from the population. But notably, typically these policies are imposed in the immediate aftermath of a conflict. That is when the pro-dictator forces are at a low. So denazification in Germany or Myanmar following the junta and the rise of Aung San Suu Kyi happens at a time when the state has a particularly high capacity for the government to regulate the speech, and the capacity goes down later on their side when they have to deal with the backlash that emerges inevitably later. Why is this active suppression likely to be done well? In other words, what are the consequences? Why is lying without consequences a good thing? First, there's likely to be relatively broad social buy-in for the suppression of information after the war. Firstly, for all the reasons I've stated, the general public typically blames the dictator for getting into the conflict in the first place. This would be denazification, for example, or MacArthur in Japan had significant local support because the consequences of that dictatorship had been horrible for the people on the ground and the average voter. But secondly, there's a resource asymmetry at the point at which these things are imposed between groups of anti-government people who have less money, time, and resources in media networks than the government who can impose far more of their will on those people. But thirdly, history is quite malleable. There are historiographical gaps that allow this to happen, so it's very plausible you can implement this narrative in a way that doesn't cause massive amounts of backlash, as opposition says. Why are we likely to attain stability on our side? No opening government has a single mechanism here illustrated in tiers, which is that when people see a minority of society supporting a dictator, they become less empathetic toward that and buy out. I'm going to characterize what this message looks like, why it will be persuasive, and co-opt their impacts through illustration. The first thing I want to say is that you raise the bar very, very high for leaders of formerly oppressed people to cooperate with the new government. The trivial reason for this is that different groups of oppressed people have different leaders and different stakeholders. Some are more radical, the Malcolm X's of the movement. Some are more moderate and want to engage with the majority, the MLKs of the movement. When you do no longer demonize the people who were part of the previous regime, who are a minority of society, and many people collectively had to work together to resist them, to overthrow the previous government in order to take them into power, it is likely that you empower the radicals who do not want to cooperate with the power-sharing agreement and the new establishment of law. At the point at which that happens, they are more likely to feel public pressure from the people who support them to pull out of those power-sharing agreements in the first place, to not cooperate with the establishment of a new government. This is critical because power-sharing agreements in the immediate aftermath of a conflict are the key thing that allows the dissemination of resources across various boundaries to minority groups, to people who were restricted and suppressed by the leadership of those states before, to the people who most critically need international investment at this crucial time when the government has changed and everything is uncertain. On their side of the house, you raise the bar for cooperation prohibitively at the point at which you see people being portrayed in a sympathetic light. And note, that doesn't have to be particularly well-versed because the people who are radical from the minority group trying to buy in, or the oppressed group trying to buy in, has so much ammunition. So if you even paint them in somewhat sympathetic light, you say, there's a few good Nazis, there's a few good people on this side, it likely means that there's a tremendous pressure on those leaders to opt out or lose their seat to more radical individuals. So you harm cooperation to a massive extent. Before I explain the second implication of this, I'll take opening.
Yeah, so new regimes bolster their legitimacy by demonizing the old one, meaning the demarcation you talk about is likely to be unnuanced, preventing any power-sharing agreements in the first place.
No, it can't be unnuanced, because if it is unnuanced and poorly illustrated, then people who participate in that regime suffer spillover conflicts. The state has a vested interest in stability. They're likely to demarcate the boundaries effectively, and that's precisely the reason it won't take the form they say it does. They say the state will blanketly demonize everyone tangentially related. So every Hutu, every Tutsi was a participant in the Rwandan regime that led to the genocide. On our side, we can attack the leaders, we can attack participants in government, but crucially, we do not attack the family down the street who shares that ethnicity. That's the boundary demarcation that we set on our side. That's what you fail to get on your side of the house. The second thing I want to say is in the absence, it's likely the public does not engage in the demonization of the regime effectively. On our side, when the state dictates the parameters of post-conflict resolution, you're far less likely to get the emergence of the narrative that they say is so bad on their side. I've already answered that in terms of POI. I won't mechanize it again. What is the comparative? And this is crucial. The comparatives you do not prevent the backlash that opening opposition is talking about. Why? Note that extremists who support the previous government want to engage in backlash anyway. Structurally, they will likely falsely claim the government is censoring and suppressing them anyway. Note that right-wing Twitter is owned by a literal right-wing billionaire in the United States, and yet his supporters continually scream about how they're being censored by the government when nothing could be further from the truth in the First Amendment protects strict censorship rules that block censorship. On their side, they're still going to engage they're being censored and claim that. The difference is, when they do, they have more power and more institutionalization in the government that doesn't happen on our side when you cut it down at its knees, because we have the needed contextualization to win this debate, and we clarify the mechanisms for opening opposition incredibly perhaps tendency.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to open the debate with closing opposition, I call for the member up. Here.
The closing opposition claim is extraordinarily simple. The practice of policing speech requires people. It requires people to go to cultural events, to see what people are saying, to actively go. It requires arresting people, throwing them in jail. It requires state capital be divested to this enterprise of policing the speech of a whole lot of people. We think that in practice, this is going to be done poorly on both the state and an individual level, and very likely to reignite violence. So that's the case from closing opposition. Notice that just firstly weighing against opening opposition, a lot of the OO claims depend on sort of the state going about this in an extreme way. The CO case, even if we think it's true, and you're only going to go after relatively extreme forms of expression, all of our material holds. Let's first talk about why the policing is going to be done poorly. Let's first respond to the preemption from CG Extension, who says that people are going to complain anyways. Yeah, but the difference is they're not actually going to be arrested. People can complain about things, but I don't think that means that they're actually going to jail. I think that's a pretty meaningful difference. So let's explain what this policing looks like. And I asked OG and POI as well to be clear on what this looks like. So OG already had a chance to engage in this mechanism. First of all, the state has very clear incentives to be self-serving. There's 3 levels that this happens. Firstly, they have incentive to draw the line and demarcate the line poorly. It's actually not clear to me what it means to glorify glorify anything. That's a very vague term. So the standards are likely to be drawn in ways that serve the state's interests. And in many cases, the state has radical base. It's a post-conflict state. So presumably they took power through conflict. So there's probably some relatively radical people within the core sort of state cabal of people who seized power, probably through violence. And as well, there was conflict, so there's lots of hate going around. So a lot of people that the state probably wants and has a clear vested interest in wanting really, really hate the people whose speech are going to be suppressed. So clear incentive to over-suppress and be extreme. But also, the state often wants to escape criticism, right? There might be people who draw comparisons with practical things the state's doing that the previous regime did well. And they can escape criticism in this way by shutting down those types of speech that they would rather not answer difficult questions like, why are you doing this one type of policy worse than the previous guy? Well, you can't answer that question. They have incentive to shut down those as well. The second way in which this policing is done bad is individual actors. I don't think cops are a very good example of people using their discretion super, super well. Because even if you have standards, the police can still go about these standards in a bad way. But what happens in Gov's world is you give them carte blanche to do essentially whatever they want, right? To show up to cultural events and shut them down. To walk into educational classrooms that are of this minority group, maybe that teach classes in the language that that minority speaks, and figure out what's going on there, right? Are cops going to go about this in an ethical way, especially when a lot of these police already hate and have really vitriolic feelings and attitudes towards the group who they view as oppressing them, who they view as ontologically evil? I don't really think so, right? I think they probably are going to go about this in a bad way. But thirdly, notice that the state's weak. Post-conflict states aren't famous for their institutional capacity. So in as far as you actually lack a lot of capital to do this policing well, I think you have to fill up that sort of capacity gap by being more aggressive. This is why states with weaker criminal justice systems often have worse prisons, often have more brutal penalties, because the only thing they can leverage is the threat of really severe consequences. So I think in as far as that has to break up the institutional capacity, probably the policing and the suppression of the speech in practice is really, really violent and oppressive. Before we explain how this has a ton of bad outcomes, let's first hear from closing.
Buy-in from a relatively small number of radicals who will always hate the regime that overthrew their government is less important than buy-in from the people who seized power, because those people are larger in number and have greater capacity to cause harms to everyone when they pull out of the governing coalition, as opposed to a small number of radicals who will always hate the new state no matter what you do.
So I don't think that they're going to hate the state no matter what. I think it's a huge difference if I see people of my ethnic minority constantly getting their shit like kicked by cops and constantly having police running through our schools. I think that's a pretty big difference. Opening?
Yeah, you have yet to disprove the outcome that we posited to opening opposition, which is that people isolate themselves even more at the point at which you allow for these forms of sympathy and forms of interpretation to exist. So why is that not an outcome that you get anyway?
I think if we want to talk about isolation, I think things are probably worse, and as far as you isolate the ability of anybody to talk and you like isolate people further, I think probably isolation is worse on your side. Let's talk about how this reignites violence. 4 points here. First, there's a countervalence effect of this narrative, because government isn't going to suppress radical extremist speech from their own community, from the people who were formerly oppressed, which is often a big problem, as we've talked about with a lot of the examples from front half. Like often the oppressed group comes into power and begins doing oppression, a la Rwanda, a la the crisis in Tigray and Ethiopia. This happens very frequently. So we think that there's importance to ensure that the speech of people who there's some level to think that they might face some oppression. Is important that those people are able to sort of express their needs and express their wants. Secondly, a lot of people, there's a lot of flashpoints in government's world. So, i.e. the arrests of, say, prominent artists, prominent cultural members, even like people who are sympathizers, right? You're like Fox News Radio House people who a lot of people from communities like they're popular enough to get arrested, right? This creates flashpoints as people protest those arrests, clash with police. Thirdly, I think it inspires a lot of revenge, right? If I'm someone who's like a sympathizer and I see my favorite Fox News house or my favorite artist or whatever get arrested, I see police coming in and fucking up our cultural event because one person flew a flag with like some person who is bad and who's sympathizing with that is bad, I think that makes me feel really angry. I feel like I should take revenge on the people who maybe beat me up, right? The cops who attacked me, who I view as indicative of this government, indicative of that group. But fourthly, I think it's kind of a cruel jape to say that we want to have democratic ideals and we care about democracy, but also all the people from the former government, shut the fuck up. You're not allowed to speak. You're not allowed to say what they want. I think that means that people lose faith in democracy, particularly from the people who you need to have faith in democracy. Impacts here are: one, there's a lot of cultural suppression as a result of this over-policing. I think that's fucking horrible. Two, lots of people go to jail. Jail is bad. It's bad for people. A lot of people who don't deserve to be in jail probably don't need to be in jail. That's bad. Thirdly, misallocation of resources. Because you have scarce resources to go around, policing is probably a bad thing when you could just build some fucking trains or something. But fourthly, backslide into conflict from the four mechanisms we explained. Lastly, I think it's very, very clear closing opposition takes this debate. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to close the debate, you decide government and call up on the whip. Here, here.
Everybody ready? I'm just making sure my camera doesn't turn off. Great. 3, 2, 1. A country cannot move forward if its feet move in opposite directions. Our extension was very simple. Matt won for you the panel that takes notes. I'm going to win the panel that doesn't take notes. Our extension was very simple. Firstly, the alternative of not doing this explains why you get harmful and unified narratives in the counterfactual, and our counterfactual of the state apparatus is better than the explicit amorphous bottom-up alternative on their side that wasn't really addressed by OG. Secondarily, the context means it's likely it can be done well, and the potential for backlash is minimal. A lot of op arguments that OG must rebut in order for their material benefits to materialize. And thirdly, the impacts of having a unified narrative makes power sharing and investment actual impacts that you should care about in this debate far harder. Let's take out OG first on the way. The issue with OG is they're contingent on this being effective against any potential backlash, but they never explain why people will just allow this to happen or be fine, or why the government has the capacity to be persuasive. I want to be clear, yes, the government has fiat, but they don't have fiat to say people will be fine with this and the nostalgia just goes away. So Matt fills in this gap. Secondarily, they never explain why the kind of rhetoric and narrative on op can't be unnuanced or unalienating besides pointing to various public sentiment that I don't know whether exists or not, whereas Matt gives you structural reasons for why it goes from the bottom up, these political entrepreneurs' incentives, etc. Next, because the paradox of intolerance implicitly says that more speech is good because it has some sort of practical, tangible benefits on the citizenry, if we prove those practical benefits are better and more likely to materialize via Matt's extension, then we beat them on their own framework. Let's then take out CO and then OO. On CO, one, they are contingent on proving that lots of people will be so riled up that they otherwise need to be policed. That is, that there is an opportunity for a lot of that policing to exist. Matt explained why there's minimal support and weakness of the regime immediately after the conflict, but it builds up over time if you allow it to manifest and fester. So they never engaged with Matt's analysis there, but I'll provide more rebuttals in my rebuttals to O and them as well, but note that they never engaged with Matt on this. Secondarily, they say the state wants to escape criticism of them, so it's likely they overextend themselves and be very policey. Note we have fiat to say we don't penalize criticism of the state. You can still for example, say the government isn't providing benefits to the citizens, you're just not allowed to support the previous dictator that will otherwise rile up ethnic tension. So we are allowed to be nuanced in the kinds of speech regulation that we're allowed to implement, so their mechanism doesn't apply with the motion. Thirdly, they say cops bad. One, if cops bad, there is more carte blanche on their side when there isn't a guideline on what speech is and is not allowed. So if you're a cop that wants to beat the shit out of minorities, now, for example, do you say anything they say might be hate speech or not, versus clear guidelines that say this is or is not hate speech that otherwise is or is not allowed. But let's say you don't buy that. Secondarily, more information exists on our side on what kinds of speech the cops might beat the shit about you exists on our side. So potential victims of police brutality now have more information to stop that, insofar as this regulation provides a little bit more clear delineation on what can and can't get them arrested. Thirdly, you probably empower minorities who fall victims to those extreme supporters of that bad speech of the previous regime, when the police now have obligations to shut down those kinds of protests, for example. So yes, cops might be bad, but also extreme radicals on their side also bad, that cops have obligations to protect minorities from those bad people. Next, on just weighing, the impacts of stability that Matt tell you are a prerequisite to all of the impacts they talk about on building roads, the alternative of policing being super expensive, etc. So if we prove to you that it is more likely that the state becomes more more unstable over time, that it is a necessary investment to stop that, even if you pay a little bit more cops' salaries. Let's get into OO now, which also removes CO. First, I'll take a POI from CO quick.
So hammers find a nail, right? There's more cops on your side of the house. It doesn't really matter what the standards are. They're going to find reasons and excuses to arrest people and shut down speech.
If that's the case, they'll do that regardless. I don't know why they need this fucking policy. So therefore, there is no delta on your side. CO just gave themselves another reason to be out of this debate. Let's take out OO now. They said, note one, you don't get the nuance that OO wants on their side. Why? The most radical and unnuanced voices tend to rise to the top. Few reasons. One, they've lost the most in the conflict and have the most incentive to make their voices heard, and they tend to be the most radical for all of the visceral emotions they face. Secondarily, their stories are the most interesting to hear, so people are the most receptive to those radical stories that are unnuanced. Thirdly, the media can weaponize these unnuanced rhetoric for sales because it's interesting to people. Fourthly, political entrepreneurs can mobilize their bases more with vile and unnuanced rhetoric. And fifthly, nuance is more complicated and has higher barriers of understanding compared to unnuanced rhetoric that is more likely to facilitate to the top, because it's easy to say
this dictator good or bad because he killed my family, not why or why not he did it. The upshot is to tell the premise of their case. There's no reason why they will get the alternative counterfactual that they otherwise need. I've given you multiple reasons why that's unlikely to be the case. Before getting into their second impact that also takes out CO, I'll give them a chance right now.
Yeah, so power sharing agreements only apply to a vast minority of cases where civil wars ended in without a clear victor. In a majority of situations where the government just has power, they have the incentives to just beat on the last regime. Children of oppressors don't deserve oppression any more than any other victims.
That's 15.
That's
That's 15. So firstly, I don't know why this is more or less likely to be the case of scenarios, but even if not, Matt's case also applies to more than just power sharing agreements, why the alternative counterfactual of a narrative that doesn't exist from the state is likely to be amorphous and fester to lead to all of the kinds of unnuanced rhetoric that you want to talk about. So the comparative in this debate is unnuanced rhetoric that can get people riled up and not lead to a post-conflict moving forward. That is more likely on their side for all of the rebuttal that I just gave. Next, they say it silos people to be anti-government and you get really bad backlash, which is also what CO run. So if I rebut this, then I also rebut that. So, one, note the context. This is usually done immediately after the conflict, when the regime supporters are usually at their weakest. They have the least ability to mobilize all this anti-state rhetoric immediately after when they've just lost, and this narrative is directly against them because they say you got us into the conflict, all the stuff Matt told you about. But secondarily, a 24-hour news cycle means that it's unlikely that this manifests significantly enough over time that you manifest the backlash that they talk about. Why? Because there are dozens, if not hundreds, of issues that are sensationalized in the news. Secondarily, people lose attention spans quickly, and thirdly, the media has incentive to push other issues to capture different audience bases. So even if there's a potential for backlash, I'm not sure it lingers on long enough for them to get the kinds of harms that they talk about. Secondly, often there were multiple different, I'm not going to give that mechanism, I don't like that one. Thirdly, you utilize people with legitimacy to otherwise support this policy. So this is the ways in which the government can do it well that Matt tells you. You can have local leaders on the ground, celebrities that want to appeal to wide bases to explain why we need to do this narrative, or business leaders that want to otherwise not deter investment. So you can mobilize public sentiment in a very malleable way and their emotions to do it the right kind of way that doesn't lead to the harms or the backlash they talk about. And fifthly, note, history is malleable. And I know Matt said this, but I want to implicate why this matters. Because it's so malleable, there's gaps in the data, there's gaps in people's stories. You can make it malleable enough for people to understand why their dictator that they love so deeply shouldn't get the actual power that they deserve. We must move forward as well.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to close the debate, I call up on the quiz. Here.
Am I good to begin? I want to start with CG's extraordinarily flippant response to our case. They say, well, if there's no guidelines whatsoever, then cops are just going to go and beat people up regardless. But no, there's a clear delta here, and Diggory explained it to you. If you create the job of information suppressor, then they're going to go and suppress information. If you don't have this job in the first place, they're probably going to be more likely to, police other kinds of crime, prevent robberies, go after murderers, etc. There's a clear delta here. And also, if you don't create this job in the first place, you're not going to have police officers going to the kinds of cultural spaces where the kinds of mispolicing that Diggory characterized you are likely to happen. The other response to our case that we get from CG is, well, former oppressors are just always going to hate the state, no matter what, so there's not a huge delta here. As Diggory explained to you time and time again in response to multiple POIs, there's a clear delta in terms of whether you're actively getting mispoliced or overpoliced, whether, for example, your dad is killed in some sort of public execution to send a message, which Diggory explained is more likely to happen in the kinds of states that we're concerned with here. You're more likely to be willing to die for revenge and to, in fact, reignite conflict by, for example, engaging in an act of terror, or sort of by example, start forming a paramilitary group, etc. And so, yes, there might be a small number of people, but importantly, a small number of people can very easily reignite conflict. With just one terror attack, with just one thing that sort of splits society apart again, that is why our case matters so much, and that is why reigniting conflict is by far the most important thing in this round, because I think it easily outweighs democratic backsliding insofar as we show we don't get war again and all the atrocities that come with war. I think we can easily take it over any other team. But with that aside, let me just quickly re-explain our case, just in case you didn't quite get it. We explained to you very clearly why it is that policing is going to be done very poorly for a bunch of reasons, state being self-serving, and state wanting to escape criticism, and most importantly, this being done by individual actors like police and military who have emotional reasons to mispolice, and then also why it is that the kinds of weak states that we're concerned with oftentimes require the kinds of over-policing that we characterize, given that they have very little capacity to police, and so they're not going to catch many people, so when they do catch someone, they need to make an example of them. That's the case. That's why it is that you get more extreme policing, and
and the kinds that in fact reignite conflict most generally. So I think we could also hopefully win on the no notes panel as well. But with that aside, let me go on to OO, because OO, I was trying to gaslight you in all the reactions to the thing that we had the same case, but we actually didn't. Let me explain to you the key distinctions here. First, their whole case is premised on the idea that, well, we're going to be demonizing the average regime member, and that's what the policy is going to say, and this is going to lead to the retribution that we are actually proving. But I think, as both gov teams have fairly pointed out, this kind of ignores the OG model. They fiat in that the policy is going to apply specifically to like the higher-ups and the dictator and the regime who are most complicit, and CG, I honestly think, proved this to some extent. And so insofar as they fail to show that the policy is going to fail to actualize in how it's implemented by individual actors, then they're completely out of this debate on the basis of just ignoring the reasonable fiat power that OG gets. So that's why we take it over them. But other things that they fail to prove. On conflict, their entire analysis here is just when you sort of attack the culture and silo them, and these people are going to go into echo chambers, and they're going to believe the other side is against them. The problem here is that there's actually no delta. Why? Because broadly speaking, the former oppressor groups are already in echo chambers. They're already congregating together because they already believe that the other side is against them. On either side of the house, there's a reasonable degree of demonization by the new regime against these sort of former oppressors, and so for that reason, there's no delta here. Where the delta is in the over-policing that we characterize. Lastly, they explain to you why it is this sort of excludes good ideas, like why does the nationalizing oil is good, but the problem is, I think this is really uncharitable, as CG points out again, because you can still argue that like policies like nationalizing oil are good in general, and so without saying that the dictator specifically did it well. So I'm very unclear on the delta here. The actual delta, in this regard, is the sort of ability to compare specific policy differences between the two regimes to escape criticism regarding whether the country is getting better or getting worse relative to like the economic or social policies of the dictatorship. That's how you get the deltas there. So because they didn't really prove that this policy will be poorly implemented, because we make it better, because we're way more charitable to go, I do think we take it over opening half. I'll take POIs starting back.
Forget all this fancy nerd stuff for a minute. Empirically, do you think the average person reasonably believes the far right is more violent in Germany, which did a massive denazification campaign and has laws in the books to this day, or the US, which names army bases after Civil War veterans and
the problem is that you just named two countries that are not post-conflict states. Two countries that can implement this in a reasonably well way. The examples that you gave in your speech is like the United States, how they would implement it. No, guys, recognize this is a post-conflict state, extraordinarily weak institutions, it will be done shittily. That was our whole case. Okay, I'll take a POI from Tom.
Yeah, my view is a lot simpler. Your delta of stability is dependent on the execution of your counterfactual being one that is good. Given that your criticism is that police forces and authority will be corrupted, why do you get that much better in your rule?
Because our whole point is it's better if police who are corrupt and do bad things apply that to like whether or not there's a burglary or whether or not there's a murder or something like that. If you're now specifically going after the kinds of speech that are mostly done by the groups that have the most potential to reignite the conflict and doing this policing in the spaces that have the most potential for things to escalate, for there to be like a shootout or whatnot, that is how you get the kinds of conflict that we characterize. All right, let's quickly talk OG and then CG. So first, OG says that it's bad when you have a sympathetic light cast towards former oppressors because then they can keep their sort of social entitlement and whatnot. But the problem is that what they fail to recognize is that once the former oppressor groups are out of power, they've pretty much already lost their social status because the new regime has a strong incentive to demonize the old regime and by extension the people here. And so because this is why, because they want to justify the new regime, and so this is and because they usually fought against the old regime, there's already incentive here to do this, and so there's no delta in terms of whether the former oppressor groups keep meaningful social status. Next, they say, well, we can create unity. Our main extension on reigniting conflict implicitly clashes with this, so I'll settle all that there. But next, they say that we have to avoid anti-democratic ideas. The problem here is, as was already pointed out, oftentimes the new system is already undemocratic, and so in all those cases, there's no delta in terms of whether or not we're preventing anti-democratic ideas. But in cases where the new system is indeed democratic, anti-democratic ideas are usually already suppressed. Why? Because the government, in these cases, will see democracy as fragile, so they'll have incentives to protect it. So the actual delta is in democratic new states is when sort of things like economic policies and whatnot that we've been discussing throughout this debate. So I don't think that they win on preventing anti-democratic ideas from entering into the discourse. Next, they say we're going to bring people towards the center and the middle ground, but in our other part of our extension, when we explain to you why it is that the only narrative now is going to be that the current system is perfect because you can't contrast it to how things were done in this specific country by the previous regime. You can't say, well, they did economic policy better, they did social policy better. For that reason, we're going to get the kind of totalizing narrative that prevents the sort of all the positives of free marketplace ideas and whatnot. And also, just even if you don't buy any of that, I think broadly speaking, we can weigh reigniting conflict over democratic backsliding, insofar as I'm not entirely clear why we have strong democracies here, and so I don't know how far we can in fact backslide, and so for that reason, I think we should go for them. Quickly on CG, first they say that the government standards are going to be really, really nuanced, but as I've already explained to you, broadly speaking, even if those are absolutely perfect policies, they're going to be implemented very poorly by the individual police officers on the ground. This is going to be NSA surveillance. No, it's probably going to be people on the ground, going to community spaces, seeing what people are seeing what art people are putting out and whatnot, and so there's also, just broadly speaking, incentives for police to misapply given that they hate the dictator and the former regime is demonized, yada, yada, yada. On the backlash point, they say, well, these people will claim to be censored on either side of the house, so there's no real delta here. But the difference here is honestly super clear. Whether you're arrested or whether your father's even killed, that kind of thing. These are the kinds of things that make meaningfully more likely to fight. And then lastly, they said that a unified narrative is good. Even if you buy this general frame, I'm not entirely convinced why they get this unified narrative, given the lack of state capacity to in fact police all of the kinds of speech that's going on here and actually to be able to sort of squash it out. So I'm not clear why they don't get a meaningful degree of narrative diversity and thus don't get any of the benefits that they want on like sort of power sharing agreements. Because we show you get way more conflict on their side, because we show you get way less accountability for states on their side. We're very proud to have taken this debate. Thank you very much.